Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. It's getting spicy going into the Chinese Grand Prix with Lewis Hamilton responding to many of the concerns from the media last weekend about the way that he treated Riccardo Adami on the radio and the drama between the pair of them during the course of the Australian Grand Prix. Hamilton today comes out and says that actually it's Max Verstappen who should be under the spotlight given what's happened with GP over the last several years, and plenty of drama about flexi wings and what that means for the weekend going on today as well. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First to all those, some really unfortunate news to share with you all this morning, and that is the fact that Eddie Jordan has unfortunately passed away, a real legend of the sport. I don't think there's anyone like Eddie Jordan that's ever really been in Formula 1. Such a charismatic individual. I think from my perspective, when I was first watching the sport as a kid from like 2007 onwards, that was after Jordan's time with his team, and all of the legendary stories from those eras had come to a close. And when Jordan was more moving towards the punditry side and much of the great work that he did, and as far as I was concerned, he was kind of an icon of the coverage, let's say, when I was first getting into watching the sport, and then hearing about all of his adventures and everything, and, the history of the Jordan Formula 1 team. He was diagnosed with, I think, a couple of forms of cancer over the last year or so, and there was talk about whether he would, successfully recover, but unfortunately that's not been the case, and of this morning, it's official that Eddie Jordan's passed away. So, yeah, true character and icon of the sport, I think, in many respects. And also just an influential person in the history of the sport in terms of finding Michael Schumacher, and so many of the stories of that era involve Eddie Jordan in some regard or another, and even in recent times still been very much involved. I mean, let's not forget that he was seemingly managing Adrian Newey in that deal that he signed to go to Aston Martin last year. So from start to end, Jordan's been, no doubt an absolute, iconic character of the sport, and I think he will be sorely missed in the paddock, and I'm sure there's going to be much discussion around his life and career and legacy over the course of this weekend. So sad news to share with you all this morning. Couple of other interesting images. This is Flavio Briatore and this is George Russell. And you might wonder, okay, why? Right? Because Russell drives a Mercedes. Russell is out of contract. I think what Russell is doing here is a little bit of playing the market. Because does he want to go and drive for Alpine? No. But if Max doesn't like the Red Bull anymore, if he wants to leave, if Mercedes are going to have the best car next year, that may be something that is a consideration at the very least, and I don't think Antonelli's going anywhere from Mercedes. So that would put George Russell potentially in a precarious position. Now, will Mercedes re-sign George and Kimi? I think there's a very plausible chance that they may well do that, especially even if Mercedes are pretty convinced that next year they're going to have a great car. They might not even need to think about worrying about the Verstappen piece and just keep Russell and Kimi as a great potential driver pairing, in which case George's market value will to some degree be defined by how much he speaks and gets offers from other teams. So I think that kind of what might be going on here is that you've got Briatore, who of course would not be opposed to the idea of someone like a George Russell coming into his team, having the discussion. Of course, he wanted Carlos Sainz last year, couldn't get him in the end, so maybe George Russell's a man that Briatore would like to have into the team. But equally for George, if he can play the market a little bit, go back to Toto and say, hey, this is what things look like, then you have to pay me more money to keep me on the team. Now, Russell was also talking about the McLaren. You guys may remember at the start of the 2023 season, Russell made the claim that Red Bull would win every race, basically, at the start of that season. I think he said that in Australia after 2 rounds of the year. And he was very nearly right. They won all races but Singapore. So he has some history making these predictions. But he says this: the gap they have this year is bigger than Red Bull ever had. I think their car is capable of winning every race. Now, is this true? Is their gap bigger than Red Bull ever had? First of all, I think that's kind of doubtful. The RB19 was, we're talking half a second, 0.6 of a second at times in race pace, quicker than anybody else in the field, sometimes even more, largely because of the way that it handled the tyres. The McLaren also this year seems to have that same mythical quantity of being able to keep the tyres in good nick and still somehow keep them warm enough to qualify very well. So, yeah, kind of remarkable, but Russell is pretty clear with his assessment here that Max was in that Red Bull car. He was pretty reliable every lap that he did, every run. He, was never really a question. I think what Russell's kind of saying is, look, McLaren have just as good of a car as Red Bull did with the RB19. but right now their drivers are not able to execute on the level that Verstappen is, which is an interesting assessment, really. But in Russell's estimation, I mean, this is not going to be a close championship. Then again, the rest could be history. I mean, he might have said the same thing after last year's start of the season with the way that Red Bull started. That then turned on its head relatively quickly, but it does seem like McLaren have such a solid base. It's tough to imagine they will squander this level of advantage. Do they have a bigger advantage than Red Bull ever had? That seems somewhat doubtful to me. I think it is more competitive at the front, but we'll get more evidence this weekend in Shanghai as to what that actually looks like. Lando even made the comment the other day that this kind of mentality from Russell is just weak mentality. Obviously it's easy to say if you're Lando because he got the fastest car, and even he now admits that. But he was calling out George and saying, look, if you're basically already admitting defeat, then that's a bad mentality. So, a bit of drama going on there, really. Lando actually did say this on Ferrari, because you guys remember last weekend, Lando made the comment that, oh, well, we know how much fuel Ferrari used in testing. They're going to be really competitive. And of course, he jinxed them and they were nowhere. Lando says, our goal was to be quickest and we were there. We expected Ferrari to be right there, but they were 7-8 tenths off. Their race pace on Friday was even better than ours almost. We were shocked, they seemed shocked that things went as it did. But still loads of questions on why Ferrari that weekend fell away from them. There was lots of talk about being forced to raise the ride height and stuff like this, and finding a fundamental flaw in the car. We'll see if that trends anywhere going forwards. Speaking of some of the other teams that either were struggling or maybe will continue to struggle, quickly on Aston Martin, rumour has it that based on their car in Australia, their car is actually substantially more competitive than they maybe thought it would be after testing. After testing, there was talk about them being maybe the ninth best car on the grid. That doesn't seem the case in Australia, but maybe there will be more surprises to come because, it's not like the Sauber was a good car exactly, but they took advantage of opportunities to finish P7 with Hülkenberg. Maybe that will not happen for some time. But I did want to at least discuss the situation with Haas. I don't know if we are again in a position where Haas follow one season, which was good, with an absolute shambles, but we may be here again because the Haas was nowhere in Australia, and I kind of felt like it was a bit of an anomaly. Maybe the weather conditions are weird because, in testing they seemed okay. They didn't really do any fast running at all, but it seemed respectable enough. And there was talk that the Haas was going to be, maybe the 7th fastest car, 8th fastest car, something in that ballpark. But they were way off the back of the grid in Australia, to such an extent that after they came out the garage in practice, Komatsu thought the car was broken, but it actually wasn't, and then they realised that they had a serious problem. So, I don't know if they can resolve this, but it does feel like a major issue with the car which they uncovered in Australia, and I'm not even sure they know what it is. More drama on the flexi wings, as always. It's never going to go away in Formula 1, certainly not right now when the Mini DRS was such a major discussion point of Australia. Now, Red Bull believe that multiple teams benefited from this Mini DRS thing. Certainly McLaren have been thrown into the conversation, Mercedes, Ferrari, among others. But, and Red Bull also say that as the wings, let's say, get more stiff and less flexible, that should benefit them because in, let's say, the last couple of years when the wings haven't been as flexible as they have been engineered to be today, they were stronger. So Red Bull feel more confident that when the flexi wings are not such a relevant factor, they will, be in a better, stronger position, and therefore if Max can just limit the damage over these first few rounds, once these flexi wing technical directives really come into force, one of which this weekend on the rear wing, and then in Spain on the front and the rear wing, then it may well benefit Max and the Red Bull. But Lando says this actually isn't, they've not got to do anything. Now, we hear this quite often, like even last year, there are rumours about what Red Bull might have been doing. Christian Horner was very quick to come out and say, look, there's nothing of the sort, we're not going to have to change anything. But Lando says this about their rear wing, we don't have to change anything, ours is fine. In fact, ours probably is too good, and we're probably not pushing the limits enough, honestly. So I feel like, Lando's a funny character, isn't he? I think he's almost being a little tongue-in-cheek here, because McLaren definitely are pushing the limits, let's be real. If this technical directive was applied for last weekend, we'd also be fine, so it's not directed at us, it seems. It's directed at other teams, which probably means we need to push it even more. So yeah, very interesting comment. Look, the way that Lando says it is very Lando, but the bottom line, I guess, is that, he says that they've not got to change anything. So would they admit to it anyway if they did? Maybe not, but certainly intrigued to your perspective on that in the comments below. Speaking of McLaren versus Red Bull, we know that Zach Brown last weekend said that they should have put Yuki in the car instead of Lawson. It's funny how these things work, because Zach Brown says it's kind of a throwaway comment, and then the journalist is talking to Lawson saying, hey, Zach Brown said this, what do you think about that? And obviously, Lawson, what can he really say? But he says, I don't care what Zach says, to be honest with you. So I thought that was a pretty fair response. In the end of the day, Lawson is trying to stay in his own lane and just, focus on trying to win and get in the position that he can be. He even said it last year when he was beefing with Fernando Alonso at Austin, that, look, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win. But obviously last weekend he did neither of those. So, he needs to have a good weekend, I would say, here in China. But the first few weekends are going to be challenging for Lawson because he's not driven many of these circuits before. This I thought was pretty funny because this comment from Zach Brown on basically Verstappen leaving for Mercedes and leaving Red Bull, Jos Verstappen was even in the replies here, which I just find this hilarious, right? Like, this is Formula 1 nowadays. You've got Jos beefing in the replies to an Instagram post talking about how Zach Brown's just trying to stir the pot. But, I mean, there were big rumours not that long ago that Jos had like a verbal agreement with Toto Wolff that they would get Verstappen if the circumstances aligned. So, there's all sorts of political posturing here in F1, as we know is always the case. This is the rear wing for the Chinese Grand Prix. There's certain sponsors that aren't allowed, of course, and this is what Red Bull are rocking with the nice Red Bull on the rear wing. Of course, it was rear wing Thursday, basically, this morning, seeing everything that's been going on in the paddock. And there's, of course, talk about what kind of downforce levels the teams will run. That may be influenced to some degree by the DRS zones. And last year, the DRS zone around China maybe wasn't quite effective enough in terms of allowing the overtakes to happen. This year, they're extending it by 75 meters, which is quite substantial. Now, the DRS zone is already long. The issue is that the corners leading up to the DRS zone are very challenging to follow through. Certainly the corner before that long straight. It's that like long right-hander where the dirty air is really affecting you. So to stay close enough in that corner, to get close enough to overtake with DRS into turn, I think it's 14, is a big challenge. So I understand why they've done this. Is it going to make it too easy? I don't know. They've got the data. They're doing the analysis. They presumably have come up with the right answer. But, do we trust them? I guess we'll see in the race. Obviously, it could rain, but pretty unlikely it will based on current forecasting. I think I saw 5% a couple of days ago as a potential wet weather forecast for the Sunday. Now, the big drama of the day was coming out of Lewis Hamilton, really. So, during the course of the Australian Grand Prix, it wasn't looking great for Ferrari. It was actually pretty horrific for Ferrari. Hamilton says, look, we're not going to be defined by the one race. We move forward. Everyone's motivated. People still believe. But there's obviously a lot that Ferrari need to learn this weekend. And also lots for, let's say, Hamilton to learn with his race engineer, Riccardo Adami. Now, of course, he worked with Vettel. He worked with Carlos Sainz. And he certainly knows what he's doing when it comes down to race engineering. But Hamilton was, in a very tricky car in wet conditions for the first time, trying to learn an awful lot about the machine and struggling with it underneath him during the course of that race. And, Adami was on the radio plenty of times saying, hey, Lewis, we got this K1, which is basically like energy deployment mode if you want to try and make the overtake on Albon. But, Hamilton in that moment decided, look, please just leave me to it in this moment. Now, I think Hamilton may be slightly misinterpreting the criticism here. But I'm intrigued to your perspective in the comments below. So the criticism on this, I don't think was necessarily how he was talking to his race engineer. It was more about the fact that they weren't seemingly fully on the same page. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. So I think Hamilton's absolutely right that the way that this has been talked about in the media at some length is probably taking things way further than they need to be. If you go back to some of the early radio comms between Hamilton and Bono, they weren't on the same page either for some time. Like, it takes a bit of time. It's not something that's just magically overnight you're going to perfectly understand what each other wants. It's something which has developed and evolved over time. And I think that for the first race, it wasn't really that bad. But it's just Hamilton was, obviously the Ferrari wasn't very good. It was struggling. And these type of radio messages were very interesting compared to what's happened previously, of course, because he knows Bono so well. But Hamilton said the following: I don't know why everyone's been so negative about these radios, because I was polite. I always said please at the end, even though I was racing. When you look at some of the other drivers who have been super vocal, almost abusive like with their engineers, have taken batterings for years, Mine didn't even take a battering. Anyways, something you can learn along the way, so from race to race, we're going to get even stronger together, and that is the most important part. Now, we said a lot on this. There were like loads of interview questions around this, and Hamilton also said this: every driver requires different information. George, for example, likes a lot of information. For me, I don't need or like a lot of information. The relationship between Bono and I took years to learn from each other. Riccardo and I are getting on super well, and that was our first race together. We dealt with 90% of those totally fine, and to be fair, it only tends to be the ones that are a bit contentious that actually ever get broadcast over the broadcast anyway, right? So that is part of it. Now, he also mentioned Max. Now, initially, he didn't mention Max by name, and then he did. So he said the following: the relative conversation that Max has with his engineer over the years, the abuse that poor guy has taken, of course, talking about Jean-Pierre Lambiase. And you never write about it, but you write about the smallest little discussion that I have with mine. Kind of interesting to me because people definitely do talk and write about when Max is kind of abusing his engineer, like in Hungary last year, of course, was a notable one. But, it's also kind of like a known thing about the way that Max and GP are. Naturally, everyone over-egged, but it's literally just a back and forth. I was very polite for how I suggested it. I said, leave me to it, please, or whatever, leave it to me, please. I wasn't saying F you, I wasn't swearing. It was just at that point I was really struggling with the car, and I needed full focus on these couple of things. We're getting to know each other. He obviously had 2 champions or more in the past, and there's no issues between us at all. Go listen to the radio calls with others and their engineers. They are far worse. And, so this was kind of the comment on the relationship between Max and GP. Now, again, I think it's an interesting statement because he's deflecting some of the discussion elsewhere, and I think to some degree understandably so. But equally, I don't think that's exactly what people were complaining about. It's not the way that Hamilton was speaking with the engineer. It was more about the fact that they weren't fully on the same page. That was the discussion. Whereas for Max and GP, yeah, sure, the radio comms get pretty, borderline abusive, as Hamilton describes it. But that's also how they work together. And when Max is slamming GP and the team over the radio, it's kind of like, yeah, that's how it is, right? Like, we know that they understand that that's how it works. And that makes sense because he's been around for a long time. So I don't really think this is a big deal. But the fact that Hamilton threw Verstappen and his relationship with his engineer into this conversation has definitely caused many question marks. And even there was a thread here from race fans looking at some of the communications that have been had on the radio for the last few years at various Grand Prix, and, some of the angry radio exchanges that Verstappen has had over time. But again, it's like, is he always roasting his own engineer? Not necessarily. Of course, he's frustrated with the car and everything. But GP gets that, and Max gets that. And that's, how it can be. So intrigued to your perspective in the comment section below. Of course, Hungary last year was one of the shining examples in many respects. And of course, there were, some Verstappen fans talking about this and, showing pictures or whatever because, the implication of abusive communication. Of course, that doesn't represent the entire relationship, but I get what Hamilton means. So it's interesting. Intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing before we close out the video. Yesterday, we talked about V10 engines in some great length because there have been rumours that V10s may be staying around. Now, Max, or returning, right, and staying earlier than expected. Now, Max, his contract with Red Bull ends in 2028. Do I expect him to see out the contract with Red Bull? Not really, as it stands. I actually think it's pretty unlikely that he will, based on the current performance trajectory of the team and the possibilities in 2026 and beyond. But I think there's been a general feeling that, let's say he does see out the contract, at that time in 2028, 2029, he may just go and drive in another series. I think that's a big discussion that's been had around Max, that he may, want to go and do Le Mans. He may want to drive in something else. Maybe he can come back to Formula 1 at some point. But the idea of V10 staying around definitely make it more appealing, as Max says, for him to stay in the sport for a little while longer. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. The next time I talk to you guys, it will be after sprint qualifying, because this evening is practice 1, then sprint quali straight away. So yeah, it's going to be a hectic weekend. I'm here on Dallas time zone, and it's a horrific time zone for this particular Grand Prix. So it's going to be challenging to get the videos done close to when the actual things are happening. But as always, I'll try my best. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.